Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling, and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. It is our last show of May. The year is just flying by, isn't it? We've got lots of great information to tell you about this week. And beginning the broadcast, Nebraska's winter wheat crop was rated 48% good to excellent in the most recent USDA crop progress report. But there are problems popping up in some of the state's fields, in particular stripe rust. Nebraska Extension Plant Pathologist Stephen Wegulo just got back from surveying some of the state's wheat and joined me with an update.
So when I'm out looking at wheat fields, I'm looking for diseases, and the main diseases I'm looking for are the fungal leaf spots, mainly septorian tan spot. Those are the two major fungal leaf spots in wheat in Nebraska. And then stripe rust, which is a disease that can cause very significant damage if it explodes. So this last week I was looking specifically for stripe rust, but other diseases as well. And so I saw the fungal leaf spots, and I saw low levels of wheat streak mosaic virus. That's a virus disease. And then I'm also looking at just the wheat condition, is how is the wheat doing? And it looked great this last week.
When producers are scouting out in their fields, and you mentioned stripe rust, what are some things they need to be looking for to determine the severity of stripe rust?
So they should be looking for the symptoms. So with stripe rust, you'll see yellow-orange pustules arranged in stripes on the wheat leaf. And they should be looking both on the top of the canopy and below the canopy, because stripe rust sometimes starts lower in the canopy because there's a lot more moisture in the lower canopy. So if you don't look in the lower canopy, you might miss it. And so look for those orange-yellow stripes on the leaves. And if you see them, then you know that there is stripe rust. It starts as like one stripe or two stripes, and if conditions are favorable, it can cover the entire leaf. We don't want it to get to the flag leaf. So, scout, and if you see stripe rust and the weather is forecast to be wet and cool to moderate temperatures, those are the conditions that favor rapid spread of stripe rust. And then you have to plan to spray to protect the flag leaf.
Yeah, and that leads into my question. What treatment and management options are available for producers? So
for producers, stripe rust can be controlled with fungicides, and pretty much every fungicide that is labeled for use on wheat will do a good job on stripe rust. There are few that are not labeled for stripe rust. So what you should do is look at the label. And most of the fungicides that are labeled for use on wheat will control stripe rust quite well. There are some that have excellent efficacy, others have good efficacy. A good resource is the wheat fungicide table, and it shows the different fungicides used on wheat and their efficacy in controlling the different diseases of wheat.
With stripe rust, at what level does this begin to impact yields for producers?
When you have those stripes on the flag leaf, then the yield is going to be impacted quite significantly. So when you see it, as I mentioned before, it may start in the lower canopy because there is more moisture, and then work its way up to the flag leaf. So you don't want it to be on the flag leaf. And if the severity on the flag leaf gets to like 20%, 25% of the flag leaf covered with stripes, then you start seeing significant yield loss. And if the entire flag leaf is covered with stripes, you could end up with up to 50% yield loss. So you don't want it on the flag leaf at all.
Stephen also told me that conditions are favorable for Fusarium head blight in western Nebraska. You can use the Fusarium risk tool to estimate the prevalence for it in your area, and we've got a link to that tool on the Market Journal website. Time for markets now, and May's cattle on feed report from the USDA shows Nebraska with 2.5 million cattle in feedlots with more than 1,000 head capacity. That's second in the nation only to Texas. The state trailed only South Dakota in commercial cattle slaughter for April, with the average live weight at more than 1,400 pounds. University of Missouri livestock economist Scott Brown joined me this week to analyze cattle markets, and we started with the latest cattle on feed report.
Yeah, Troy, I think if we look at what we got on in the cattle on feed report last week, again, we're going to ignore the comparison to year ago levels just because of how down we were a year ago because of COVID-19. But when you look at what we got out of the report this year relative to 2019, we were actually down in terms of cattle placed on feed in April, down around 5%. And so, you know, I want to make sure we talk about there's probably fewer cattle coming. This, I think, is in lockstep with what we've been seeing in terms of slightly fewer cows and slightly smaller calf crops as we've gone the last year and a half or so. And so maybe some better news coming as we get further down the road of less fed cattle supplies trying to hit processing as we get late in 2021 at least.
And Scott, I also want to get your take on pasture conditions. I read this and I thought it was interesting. The percent of pasture rated poor and very poor is the highest since 1995. How much are these conditions playing into the markets, and how should a producer respond?
Yeah, Troy, boy, you ask the question that really worries me for a lot of producers today. And when you look at that poor, very poor, that's been a little on the plus side of 40%, it's the time of year where we need to be growing grass. You know, if you look back over all weeks, there's only 8% of the time that we're north of 40% bad or very bad, and never before has it occurred in a spring month like this. We're starting the growing season. You look at the Dakotas, for example, very tough situation, and you kind of wonder, even with some good rains at this point, I think we've really stunted pastures and hay possibilities. To the plus side of this for a second, I will say when you look at some of the latest data, places like Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, a little bit of Texas has gotten better in terms of some recent rainfall, but we're certainly setting the stage for what could be a tough year. Of course, predicting rain from now until we get through this year is a little tough for us to do, but I'm certainly worried for those producers that are in the midst of the worst of the drought.
And you alluded to this, with less hay and then higher feed costs, it seems like producers just can't catch a break.
It has been tough, and you mentioned two of those reasons. You know, the cost side of the equation is not helping really anyone along the way. If you look at what feed yards are paying for corn right now, one has to be worried about what feeder cattle are going to be worth as we go forward. We have gotten a little bit of break this week in terms of corn costs, but I always say we're a long ways away from that corn crop in the bin at this point, so who knows whether we get some additional run up in corn prices. I think on top of that, you know, we got producers today who also look forward and see these really high beef prices, yet cattle prices they're receiving aren't in lockstep with those higher beef prices. So there's just so many things that are on top of them at the same time. It's tough right now for a lot of cattle producers in the country.
Given where feed prices are, do you expect weights to pull back a little bit, or is that something that we're already seeing?
So we have at least seen cattle weights that are back to where we were a year ago. Now that's still pretty high relative to the previous 5 years. I think if you push some of these $7 corn and above at us for a while, we'll pull weights down as we move forward. I think that's the sure sign of that. And Troy, honestly, that could be a real positive for at least beef prices as we get in later 2021. We could be in a situation where we continue to have fairly tight beef supplies, and if demand stays as strong as it's been, it could look really good for us.
With all the factors that you've discussed, are we seeing herd liquidation at all?
Yeah, so I think we are. You know, we got livestock slaughter out last week as well, and beef cow slaughter year to date's 10% higher than it was in 2020. That tells me that we've got fewer cows out there as we go forward. Now, I think a lot of that, Troy, is related to some of the dry weather that we're seeing. At the same time, when you look at the percentage of heifers that we've got in feed yards, that's also a fairly high number, telling me that producers aren't holding back heifers to put back in the herd. So I think we're going to continue to see a lower herd. For me, exactly how much lower has so much to do with what pasture and rainfall looks like here for the remainder of 2021.
Okay, Scott, Memorial Day a few days away, and I am smelling the grills firing up already. What can we expect in terms of beef demand as we get closer to summer?
Yeah, I think we've seen some pretty strong demand, and I think that will continue. And I really like to talk about, I look at things like loin, so I'll back up and say, you know, choice box beef sitting here about 3 1/4, not surpassing the peak we saw back in the shutdown of 2020, but much higher than we've seen for a period of time. Things like loin prices have just been on a rocket, if you will. I think as we're opening up food service, there's a lot of folks, I always say, folks are ready to get out. They're ready to be beyond COVID-19. And the one thing that I want to go out and have a really good meal. And if I want to have a really good meal, what do I ask for? I want a really good steak. And so I think that loin demand has been really strong as food service comes back on. I think as we get in the grilling season, again, I think consumers are ready to get out and do some things that really we haven't been able to do for a number of months. I think that's all positive for beef demand here for at least the next 3 or 4 months.
Next week, we'll be joined by Jeff Peterson to discuss grain markets. Next up, on-farm research has been ongoing with Nebraska Extension for a number of years. Results show that producers implementing on-farm research practices enjoy positive results, including increased yields. Market Journal's Bill Dodd spoke with research participant Ken Herz to learn more about an ongoing study that examines the impacts and economics of grazing cover crops in non-irrigated rotations.
In south-central Nebraska, much of the agricultural ground is dry land and split about 50-50 in terms of cropland and rangeland. In non-irrigated systems, implementing cover crops into your rotations can diminish crop yields during times of limited precipitation. However, it seems using cover crops for forage could offset costs while retaining soil benefits.
Was interested in looking at some type of a system that we could help with the rangeland grazing late season. Was wondering if we can incorporate some type of a cover crop into our farming operation that would take some of the pressure off the grazing of the pastures late season. So that really is why I was looking at it. I was really interested in a systems approach that examined integrating the livestock into a dry land cropping rotation by adding and grazing cover crops. In the end, I think we wanted to understand the system profitability as well as effects on soil health.
Research over the past few years has been conducted in separate counties, one location in Nuckolls County and the other in Webster County. With varying conditions and variables for each location, there were, of course, varying results when it came to yields.
There was a little bit of difference between the Nuckolls County and the Webster County, and there's a couple things that were a little bit different. In the Nuckolls County plot, we had to haul water to the cattle, and that made an additional expense that in the Webster County, there was a system in place, and that greatly reduced the cost of watering to the cattle. Another thing was that in the Webster County, we used a summer annual cover crop mix. In the Nuckolls County, we used a cool season cover crop mix. We had a lot more biomass produced in Webster County with a summer annual. We think that is probably had a big effect on it. And the other thing, finally, in the Nuckolls County, we had 1 year where we had a really dry summer where we had soybeans out there. And in that particular case, where we had the grazed cover crop had a diminished yield compared to the traditional 3-crop rotation or just a cover crop without grazing.
Now, in the 5th year of this particular study, Ken tells me the data that is coming out of the research is promising in terms of being able to give producers in that region a better understanding of the benefits and drawbacks of grazing cover crops. Moreover, following this research could bear fruit for producers in terms of what approaches have already been implemented throughout the study.
It gives us more confidence to make recommendations the farther we get into this, and the more data we get in this thing. But I think you can. What we're looking at is looking at a summer annual cover crop and focusing on that. It's also apparent that the benefit you get from cover crop, if you want to look at it from the economic standpoint, is you have to graze it. Because if you have a cover crop that is ungrazed, you basically have just the cost of getting the cover crop established without getting any returns from it. And we really think that there's a benefit to have grazing the cover crop of livestock. We also think there's a benefit to improving soil health grazing livestock, because what we have seen in the soil health is that the cover crop that is grazed has more biosolial activity to it. And we think that is really important too.
While this research has already yielded useful data for producers, Ken says there's still work to be done. While other rotation options may be looked at in the coming years, there's still a lot to learn about the soil benefits as well.
I think one of the things that we're going to try and do is fine tune what we're looking at. Again, as I said, I think we're going to be looking at summer annual cover crop. See if that makes any difference from here on out. And the other thing is that we really want to get a handle on the microbial biomass and fungi biomass that we're having, and trying to put a value on that. And that is one of the things that's really hard to do. Right now, with this study, we are looking at the economics of it, and we aren't focusing too much on what is actually happening in the soils, other than trying to do some measurements to see the activity in the soil.
Even though a plethora of data has already been produced from this study, there's still much to learn, and we'll continue to follow any updates that come. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks, Bill. If you'd like to learn more about on-farm research or this particular research project, check out the information we've posted on the Market Journal website. Next up, everyone has a role to play in the Hookstein dairy farming operation near Wynot. Neil and Charlie Hookstein, along with their 4 daughters and son-in-law, all play a part. The family's dairy legacy goes back to 1894. They milk between 120 and 140 cows, with everyone working together toward the goals of caring for the cow herd, providing a healthful dairy product for consumers, having fun, and learning a few lessons along the way. You can read all about Hookstein Dairy in the cover feature story in the June Nebraska Farmer. Next up, a few weeks back, we shared with you some ways to make sure your center pivot is running smoothly for growing season. But for some farmers, over-irrigating can impact crop yields and cost extra money they don't need to be spending. I talked with Nebraska Extension Steve Melvin to find out how big of a problem over-irrigating really is and what producers can do.
I take a look at the Upper Big Blue NRD numbers each year. They require each producer to turn in a log, basically, of soil water for one field. And taking a look at those, there's about 25-30% of the guys do a pretty good job. And there's, the rest could do a little better. In fact, about 25% of those could do a lot better. There's certainly some room for improvement for quite a few guys, but some could save a lot of water and money.
And do you have a breakdown as to how much of an impact over-irrigation can have on cost of production?
Well, it's like most things in life, it's varied. If you're here in the Platte Valley where I'm located with some really shallow wells, a good low pressure pivot, you might only cost $150, $200 to run the pivot, a typical quarter section pivot around once, putting on 1 inch of water. you're farther west in the state with some of our deeper wells, maybe a 350-foot lift, running diesel instead of electricity, you might be over $1,500 to apply that same 1 inch of water.
I want to go back to what you mentioned earlier on when you said about 25% of farmers could be doing a much better job when it comes to their irrigation management. For the farmer who wants to really pin down their irrigation plan for the upcoming growing season, give me an idea about the best way to approach scheduling that irrigation.
Well, there's a couple of different things that you can do. I mean, you kind of need to know yourself. If you're willing to, get some soil water monitoring equipment, install it and take the readings from it and do the analysis, that's the lowest cost way that you can go out there and do a really good job of putting on the correct amount of water to get optimum yields. A lot of the NRDs, NRCS have some cost share to help purchase that equipment, and then it's just a matter of getting it installed. And now is the time to get it installed, when the corn or soybeans are very small, so you don't do, damage them. And, you need to make sure that, keep in mind that those plants right around the immediate area where you install that soil water monitoring equipment is an integral part of that sensor. It's representing all the rest of the plants in the field. So if you step on one or even go out there when it's muddy and compact the soil in that area, you can, change how that plant is going to react, and thus your numbers will be off some.
So would you advise a producer to pay closer attention to the calendar or how the crop is doing when it comes to irrigation management?
Well, really, you kind of want to pay attention to both. This time of year, we know the crop water use is small, but as we get on into the hot part of the summer, we know the crop is full canopy. The crop can easily use a couple inches of water a week, as where, earlier and later on, it might be half that much or less. And so we need to pay attention to the calendar, the growth stage, but also the weather has a big impact. If we've got that summer when, it's full canopy, if it's a hot, dry, windy week, it might exceed 2 inches. If it's a cool week when we get a little bit of rain and it's kind of moist, it might only use 1 inch. So we really need to pay attention to both the weather as well as the calendar.
If you're a farmer who wants to start soil monitoring or ET gauges, anything like that, what's the startup cost to do it?
Well, of course, it depends. Again, there's a wide range of it, but you can get some lower cost equipment. And like I say, a lot of the NRDs will cost share on some of it. So you could probably get started into a field for, $200 to $400. If you want equipment that's got telemetry on it and puts the data onto a computer website for you, so you can just look at it on your smartphone or your desktop computer, it's going to cost more, maybe $1,000 to $2,000, depending on what you get. So it's a range, and how much automation you want with it is certainly impacts that. But again, there's cost share money usually on that, and so you can get into it pretty reasonably.
Thanks to Steve for being on the show. And we're going to end things today with weather and Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist Al Dutcher. Al, a new month is almost upon us. What's in the forecast?
Well, Troy, we actually are getting through the end of the month of May. We did see some decent precipitation across western Nebraska, southwest Nebraska early in the week. And then, of course, as that upper air low pivoted out of this central Rockies, almost due north up into the eastern portion of Montana, we started to see it turn to the right and basically move toward the Great Lakes, and we essentially had a zonal flow because of that blocking ridge in the southeast. That allowed a fairly strong wave to move through the region, particularly Wednesday night to Thursday morning. We've seen some tornadic activity in Kansas that spread into southwestern Nebraska. Unofficial reports right now, at least from the Storm Spotter Network, is that we had 8 confirmations in terms of tornadic activity. There may likely be more, depending on if we have some unaccounted for storm damage that needs to be assessed by the NWS. So a little bit more active weather than we've been accustomed to. This basically doubles what we've seen for the month so far. So we're starting to get fairly close to normal, at least for this time of the year, for where we should be in terms of tornadic activity. In terms of precipitation, the heaviest of it again fell across southern Nebraska and missed much of northeast Nebraska. So let's take a look at the upper miles and see if we may have some additional chances for precipitation. I'll draw your attention to the trough that was responsible for severe weather to our east. We have another trough that is moving across southern Canada that is going to bring a cooler conditions, particularly as we get to the second half of this weekend. But for overall today, it should be a fairly nice day as we have a slight southerly flow coming out of this Gulf, and with that moisture feed up into the western Nebraska may generate some thunderstorm activity during the evening hours. But as we get into tomorrow, we'll start to see that trough basically pivot down, and that'll allow some energy to move through the state as we get into Sunday and Monday. Low pressure stacks up in Texas. That's going to help to lift Gulf moisture up into the region. We start to see thunderstorm activity breaking out across the southern half of the state. And as we get into Monday, that trough will pivot over toward eastern Nebraska, and we will start to see some thunderstorm activity move into the remainder of the eastern part of the state as that low pressure over the Kansas City region will help to generate a fairly widespread convective complex that we might see some more severe weather across the southeastern one-third of the state. By Tuesday, that trough starts to deepen as it approaches the Great Lakes. That's going to pull some very cool conditions back into our region. Low pressure up in the arrowhead of Minnesota and low pressure down in Arkansas will keep the primary moisture to the east of us. So we should start to see clearing conditions and much cooler conditions as we will see highs primarily stuck in the 60s. And that trough basically will stay pretty much in place as we go into Wednesday with a low pressure over north central Iowa. Once again, that will help the Gulf moisture feed up into the eastern Corn Belt. There may be some backside precipitation with a weak wave moving through, but it looks like we'll basically cut this low off to some point on Thursday over the central Corn Belt, and that will keep us in the cooler conditions, at least in the eastern half of the state, with low pressure to our east over southern Michigan. That will keep most of the moisture well to our east, and we'll be into those clear skies. As we get into the day on Friday, basically we were going to start to see that low pivot over toward the Great Lakes, and we start to see high pressure building in. So we may see some warmer conditions, but there's a subtle wave that'll move on the back side of that trough that may generate some additional moisture as we have a low pressure over north central Kansas that's going to try to lift some of this moisture up. But again, this system is going to take a lot of that energy away. So overall, the best chances of moisture over this period will be this late this weekend into early next week, and most particularly over the eastern half of the state. As we go even farther out, we see below normal temperatures to our south, according to CPC, above normal to our west. And in terms of precipitation, the vast majority of precipitation shifts off to the east, although there are signs of another low developing in the Pacific Northwest for around the second week of June.
Thanks, Al. That's going to do it for this week's show. You can watch any of these stories again on the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching and have a great Memorial Day.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.